Charles humiliated me in front of 20 elite guests, calling me street garbage and demanding his son leave me. He didn't know I secretly owned the debt propping up his entire empire, so I made one call and destroyed him. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The fever had been raging for 3 days, a relentless, burning ache that settled deep into my bones and made every breath feel like drawing glass into my lungs. My doctor had diagnosed it as a severe respiratory infection, explicitly ordering me to stay in bed, hydrate, and absolutely avoid any stress. My modest apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt like a cramped, overheated prison. The blinds were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting long, dusty shadows across the hardwood floor. A half-empty mug of cooling ginger tea sat on the nightstand next to a mountain of crumpled tissues and a bottle of antibiotics. I shivered, pulling the heavy duvet up to my chin, staring blankly at the ceiling. I was physically exhausted, but my mind was spinning. I needed Ezekiel. I had texted him hours ago, a simple, pleading message. Fever spiked again. Can you come over? Need you. For 3 years, Ezekiel and I had been building a life together. We had talked about the future, about marriage, about escaping the overwhelming, suffocating shadow of his father, Charles. Ezekiel had always promised me that we were a team. But as the hours ticked by in the silent, oppressive heat of my bedroom, that promise felt incredibly hollow. Finally, the sharp, jarring ring of my phone shattered the quiet. I fumbled for it, knocking the pill bottle over in my haste. It was Ezekiel. "Zeke," I rasped, my voice barely more than a dry whisper. "Where are you?" "I feel terrible." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't have the warm, comforting tone I desperately needed. It was tight, formal, and rushed. "Mia, I can't make it over tonight. I'm still at the office." "The office?" I coughed, the sound tearing at my throat. "It's 8 o'clock. You said you were wrapping up at 5. Zeke, I can barely stand up." I know," he sighed, and I could hear the faint, underlying edge of irritation in his tone. "But my father called a last-minute strategy meeting. The quarterlies are down again and he's completely spiraling. I have to be here to manage him. You know how he gets." "But I'm sick," I whispered, a cold dread beginning to pool in my stomach, competing with the heat of the fever. "I just need you for an hour." "Mia, please, don't make this harder than it has to be," Ezekiel said, his voice hardening. "This is my family's legacy. My father is under an immense amount of pressure right now, which actually brings up something we need to talk about." I swallowed painfully. "Talk about what?" "The dinner party this Friday," he said. The hesitation was back, but it was replaced quickly by a rehearsed cadence. "My father is hosting the regional directors. It's a very big deal, and he said that if you are going to attend as my partner, he needs some assurances." "Assurances?" I echoed, my brain struggling to process the word through the fog of my illness. "What does that mean, Ezekiel?" He had the legal team draft a sort of preliminary disclosure agreement, Ezekiel mumbled. "It's just standard procedure, Mia, given your background and, well, given the disparity in our financial situations. He just wants to make sure that his assets, the family assets, are insulated from any liabilities. He wants you to sign a document stating you have no legal claim to any of his wealth before you sit at his table." The room seemed to spin. I sat up slowly, clutching the blanket, my heart hammering against my ribs. "He wants me to sign a prenuptial agreement before we are even engaged, just to attend a dinner party." "It's not a prenup." Ezekiel snapped, clearly defensive now. "It's just a safeguard. You know how protective he is. You know you don't come from money, Mia. He just needs to know you aren't after the company. And honestly, considering how much you've been complaining about my hours lately, I can't entirely blame him for wanting to protect our interests." The silence that followed was deafening. The man I loved, the man I had supported, was not only abandoning me when I was physically vulnerable, but he was actively adopting his father's toxic, elitist paranoia. He was looking at me not as his partner, but as a potential liability, a parasite. "You agree with him," I said, the words falling like lead weights. "I just think it's the easiest way to keep the peace," Ezekiel replied coldly. "I'll have Serenity drop the paperwork off tomorrow. Just sign it, Mia. Get some sleep." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in the quiet room. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen as the first tears finally broke past my eyelashes, hot and stinging against my flushed cheeks. I had given this man my heart, my patience, and my absolute loyalty, and at the first sign of pressure from his father, he had offered me up as a sacrifice to Charles's ego. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The next morning did not bring relief. The fever had broken slightly, leaving me hollowed out, trembling, and utterly exhausted. I managed to drag myself to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, my reflection in the microwave door revealing pale, drawn skin and dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. The physical illness, however, was nothing compared to the sharp, twisting agony in my chest. Ezekiel's words echoed relentlessly in my mind. "You don't come from money. Standard procedure. Keep the peace." I was sitting at the small kitchen island, wrapping my cold hands around a mug of hot water when the sharp, staccato rap at my door startled me. It wasn't a friendly knock, it was impatient and authoritative. I pulled my thick robe tighter around myself and shuffled to the door, checking the peephole. It was Serenity, Ezekiel's older sister. I took a deep, steadying breath and unlocked the door. Serenity swept into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, bringing with her an overwhelming wave of expensive, cloying perfume that instantly made my stomach churn. She was dressed impeccably, as always, a tailored designer coat draped over her shoulders, a silk blouse, and a handbag that cost more than my car. "God, Mia, it smells like a hospital ward in here," Serenity declared, her nose wrinkling as she surveyed my small, uncluttered living room with undisguised disdain. "Ezekiel said you were under the weather, but I didn't realize you were practically on your deathbed." "Hello, Serenity," I said, my voice raspy. "I have a severe infection. What are you doing here?" She ignored my question, walking over to my small bookcase and dragging a manicured finger along the wood, checking for dust. "I really don't understand how you live in such a compact space. It must be so suffocating. I suppose you're used to it, though, given your upbringing." I tightened my grip on the door handle. Serenity, much like Charles, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my supposedly inferior status. They saw my modest lifestyle as proof of poverty, a lack of ambition, and a lack of pedigree. They saw a woman who shopped at regular grocery stores, who drove a 5-year-old sedan, and who rarely spoke about her career. "Ezekiel mentioned you were bringing something," I said, cutting straight to the point, unwilling to endure her thinly veiled insults any longer than necessary. Serenity stopped examining my furniture and turned to me, a tight, artificial smile stretching across her heavily contoured face. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. She held it out to me between 2 fingers, as if the paper itself might contaminate her. "Yes. Father insisted I bring this to you personally," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's the character clause Ezekiel mentioned. Father is hosting the regional directors this Friday, and frankly, having you there is already a massive concession on his part. He just needs this signed to ensure you aren't entertaining any grand illusions about our family's wealth." I didn't take the envelope immediately. I just stared at it, the physical manifestation of their complete lack of respect for me. "Go on, take it," Serenity urged, thrusting it closer. "It's just legal jargon. It basically says you understand that any gifts or access to our lifestyle are purely at Father's discretion, and you waive any right to claim palimony or pursue our assets should your little arrangement with my brother come to an end. It's for your own good, really. It manages expectations." I slowly reached out and took the envelope. It felt heavy, loaded with arrogance and cruelty. "And Ezekiel is perfectly fine with this," I asked softly, Serenity let out a short, sharp laugh. Ezekiel understands reality, Mia. He's the heir to a massive enterprise. You are. Well, you're a lovely girl, I'm sure, but you're a distraction. Father is simply protecting the empire. She turned toward the door, clearly eager to escape my apartment. Have it signed by tomorrow. I'll send a courier. And do try to look presentable on Friday. Father's guests expect a certain standard. With a final, dismissive wave, she walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. I stood alone in the hallway, looking down at the thick envelope. A strange, eerie calm began to wash over me, cooling the feverish heat in my blood. They truly believed they held all the cards. They believed their wealth made them untouchable, superior, and immune to consequence. They looked down on me because of my small apartment and my quiet demeanor. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand the sheer magnitude of Charles's arrogance, one had to understand the foundation of my relationship with Ezekiel. We had met 3 years ago at a mundane coffee shop in the financial district. Ezekiel had been having a visible panic attack over a spilled latte and a ruined presentation. I had calmly stepped in, helped him clean up, and, noticing the structural flaws in the financial projections he was fretting over, offered a few quiet suggestions. He had been captivated. In the beginning, Ezekiel was a kind, albeit deeply anxious, man living under the crushing weight of his family's expectations. He didn't want to run the company, he wanted to be an architect. But Charles demanded absolute obedience. For 3 years, I had been Ezekiel's silent pillar. When Charles berated him in front of the board, I was the one holding him as he cried in my tiny apartment. When he had to submit complex restructuring plans, I was the one staying up until 3:00 a.m., secretly rewriting them so they made sense, letting him take all the credit just so his father would finally smile at him. I sacrificed my own sleep, my own free time, and poured my energy into supporting him, believing that eventually, my love would give him the strength to stand on his own. But Charles was a black hole, consuming everything around him. Charles was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced obsolete aristocrats. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair that was always impeccably styled, tailored suits that cost more than a year's rent, and a posture so rigid it looked painful. But it was his eyes that were the most striking. They were a pale, icy blue that evaluated everyone he met not as human beings, but as assets or liabilities on a balance sheet. I remembered my formal introduction to him vividly. Ezekiel had finally brought me to the sprawling family estate for a Sunday brunch. The dining room was larger than my entire apartment, dominated by a massive mahogany table. Charles had barely looked at me when we were introduced. He continued cutting his steak, his knife scraping loudly against the china. "So, Mia," Charles had said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that demanded absolute silence from the room. "Ezekiel tells me you work in an office. Clerical work, is it?" "I work in finance, sir," I had replied politely. Charles had let out a small, dismissive scoff. "Finance? Everyone calls themselves a financier these days if they can balance a checkbook. Tell me, who are your people? Where did your family summer?" "My parents were public school teachers," I answered, keeping my chin up despite the sudden tension in the room. "We didn't summer anywhere, we worked." Charles had finally stopped cutting his meat. He looked up, his icy eyes locking onto mine, a look of profound distaste crossing his features. "I see, nobility in labor and all that nonsense. Well, I suppose someone has to do the drudgery." He had turned his attention back to his meal, completely dismissing me from existence. From that day forward, Charles made it his personal mission to remind me of my place. He would purposefully mispronounce my name. He would ask invasive, pointed questions about my little accounting job, mockingly wondering if I was struggling to pay my rent. He constantly paraded wealthy, well-connected women in front of Ezekiel at family events, loudly wishing his son would find someone with proper breeding. Through it all, Charles cultivated an image of immense power and untouchable wealth. He threw lavish parties, bought expensive sports cars, and constantly boasted about the Thorn Empire. He was a man deeply obsessed with appearances, completely disconnected from the reality of his own business. And now, he had managed to poison Ezekiel completely. He had convinced the man I loved that I was nothing more than a beggar at their gates, demanding I sign my own dignity away just to share a meal with them. I looked down at the cream-colored envelope in my hand. The sadness that had been crushing my chest began to harden, crystallizing into something entirely different. It was cold, sharp, and focused. I walked over to my kitchen counter, picked up a pen, and stared at the dotted line where Charles expected my subservient signature. I stared at the dotted line on the thick, cream-colored paper. Serenity's cloying perfume still hung in the air of my small apartment, a lingering reminder of the utter contempt the Thorne family held for me. My hand, holding a cheap ballpoint pen, trembled slightly, not from the lingering fever, but from the sudden, tectonic shift happening within my own mind. I had spent 3 years shrinking myself. I had hidden my success, my drive, and my reality, all to avoid intimidating a man who was perpetually overshadowed by his father. I had thought my modesty would bring us closer. Instead, it had made me a target. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the pen down on the kitchen counter. I didn't drop it. I placed it with the finality of a judge bringing down a gavel. I pushed the insulting legal document away. The time for shrinking was over. I walked over to the modest desk in the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. I bypassed my personal profile and entered a complex sequence of keystrokes, bringing up a heavily encrypted secondary login screen. I retrieved a physical security key from a hidden compartment in the desk drawer, inserted it, and typed in a 20-character password. The screen shifted, the stark, minimalist interface of Vance Holdings loading instantly. The Thorne family, with all their snobbery and desperate clinging to high society, operated under a massive, fundamental delusion. They believed I was a low-level accountant, a pencil pusher scraping by in a cramped apartment. They didn't know that my little accounting job was actually managing my own private equity firm. I specialized in distressed assets, corporate turnarounds, and quiet, aggressive acquisitions. I had built a billion-dollar portfolio by identifying failing, bloated companies, buying their debt for pennies on the dollar, and either restructuring them or liquidating their assets. I preferred anonymity. I didn't need my name on buildings. I needed control. And I had absolute control over Thorne Industries. I pulled up the master file for Charles's so-called empire. The numbers painted a catastrophic picture. Thorne Industries was functionally bankrupt. They hadn't turned a legitimate profit in 4 years. Charles's obsession with maintaining his lavish lifestyle, the estate, the cars, the extravagant parties, had drained the company's operating capital. 18 months ago, they had been on the verge of total collapse. No reputable bank would touch them. Because I loved Ezekiel, because I couldn't bear to watch him lose his family's legacy, I had quietly intervened. Using a series of shell companies, Vance Holdings had stepped in as an anonymous angel investor, providing a massive $150 million mezzanine debt facility to keep Thorne Industries afloat. I had written the terms myself. They were generous, but they included strict covenants regarding executive compensation and asset management. Charles had violated every single one of them. I picked up my phone and dialed David, my lead general counsel and the only person who knew the full extent of my involvement with the Thornes. He answered on the second ring. "Mia," David's sharp, professional voice came through the speaker. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I thought you were strictly on bed rest fighting off that infection." "The infection is clearing, David," I said, my voice steady, the raspy weakness completely gone. "But I need you to initiate a new protocol. Pull the master file on the Thorne Industries debt facility." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on his end. "Pulled? What are we looking at? Has Charles Thorne managed to sink the ship entirely?" "He's certainly trying," I replied, staring at the screen. "He just tried to force me to sign a pseudo-prenuptial agreement to attend a dinner party, waving his imaginary wealth in my face. I've had enough. I want you to audit his recent expenditures. Look for any breach of covenant. I want to know exactly how he's funding this massive dinner party on Friday." "Understood," David said, a hint of predatory satisfaction in his tone. And if I find the breaches? Prepare the default notices, I commanded, the coldness in my own voice surprising me. Draft the asset freeze injunctions. Have everything ready to file the moment I give the word. I want the paperwork ironclad. When we drop the hammer, I want it to shatter his world instantly. Consider it done, Mia. I'll have a preliminary dossier to you by tomorrow afternoon. I ended the call. The fever had broken, replaced by a chilling clarity. Charles Thorne had demanded I prove I wasn't a threat to his empire. I was about to show him that I wasn't a threat, I was the owner. By Thursday afternoon, my physical strength had largely returned, fueled by a potent mixture of antibiotics and simmering outrage. I dressed carefully, not in my usual casual attire, but in a tailored, charcoal gray suit that cost more than Charles's entire bespoke wardrobe, a subtle armor I rarely wore. I took a cab to the towering glass and steel monolith that housed Thorne Industries' headquarters. The lobby was a testament to Charles's ego: imported marble floors, absurdly large abstract sculptures, and a reception desk that looked like a command center. I bypassed the front desk entirely, ignoring the receptionist's indignant calls, and swiped myself into the executive elevator using a master access card I technically wasn't supposed to possess, but which Vance Holdings required as a condition of the debt. I strode past Charles's startled executive assistant and opened the heavy mahogany door to his corner office without knocking. Charles was sitting behind a desk the size of a small boat, dictating something into a silver recorder. He looked up, his icy blue eyes widening in genuine shock before narrowing into a glare of absolute fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, slamming the recorder down. "How did you get past security? This is a private office, young lady." "We need to talk, Charles," I said calmly, stepping fully into the room and letting the door click shut behind me. I didn't take a seat. I stood near the center of his opulent, ridiculous office, holding the cream-colored envelope Serenity had delivered. "We have absolutely nothing to discuss unless it involves you handing over that signed document," Charles sneered, gesturing dismissively toward the envelope in my hand. "And even then, your presence here is a gross violation of protocol. Ezekiel is not here, so you have no reason to be." "I'm not here for Ezekiel," I replied. I held up the envelope. "I'm here to return this, unsigned." I tossed it onto his immaculate desk. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud against his leather blotter. Charles stared at the envelope, a dark, ugly red flush creeping up his neck. The mask of the polished aristocrat slipped, revealing the vicious, petty tyrant beneath. He stood up slowly, planting his hands flat on the desk, leaning forward in an attempt to physically intimidate me. "You stupid, arrogant little girl," he hissed, his voice dropping an octave. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? You think because my son has a soft spot for charity cases that you have leverage here. I can crush you. I can make one phone call and ensure you never work in the city again. You will be blacklisted from every accounting firm in the state." I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, my expression completely blank. "Your threats are as empty as your balance sheets, Charles." He froze, the red flush instantly draining from his face, leaving him pale. "Excuse me." "I said your threats are empty," I repeated, my voice steady and clear. "Just like your company, I've heard the rumors, the restructuring, the desperate search for capital. I know about the failed Sterling acquisition that you thought you swept under the rug. You lost $30 million on a speculative real estate deal in a single quarter." Charles's eyes darted nervously toward the door, as if terrified someone might have overheard. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a clerk. You're repeating idle gossip." He tried to recover his bluster, puffing out his chest. "Listen to me very carefully, Mia. You are going to attend that dinner tomorrow night. You are going to sit there quietly, and you are going to let Ezekiel explain to our guests that you simply aren't a fit for our family. You will allow him to end this cleanly, publicly, and without a scene. If you refuse, I will personally see to it that you are ruined." It was a pathetic, poorly executed threat, He was trying to force a public breakup to save his own pride, completely unaware of the absolute destruction hovering over his head. "I will be at the dinner, Charles," I said softly, turning toward the door. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I spent Thursday evening pacing my apartment, waiting. At exactly 8:00 p.m., my encrypted inbox pinged. David had delivered the dossier. I downloaded the files and began reading. What I found was far worse than financial mismanagement or simple incompetence. Charles Thorne wasn't just a terrible businessman, he was a criminal. To maintain the illusion of his immense wealth, to fund the extravagant dinner parties, the private jets, and his wife's shopping habits, he hadn't just drained the operating capital. He had been systematically embezzling from the Thorne Industries Employee Pension Fund. He was stealing the retirement savings of the factory workers, the middle managers, the people who had dedicated their lives to his family's company, all to prop up his own ego. It was a massive, federal-level fraud. And the $150 million debt facility I had provided. He had used a portion of it to temporarily cover his tracks, essentially using my money to facilitate his theft. A wave of pure, unadulterated disgust washed over me. I printed the most damning documents, wire transfer logs, falsified internal audits, and the direct route of stolen funds into his personal offshore accounts. I laid them out on my kitchen table, the undeniable proof of a monster. Just as I was organizing the final stack, the buzzer to my apartment sounded. It was Ezekiel. When I opened the door, he looked haggard. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were dark with stress and anger. He didn't greet me, he simply pushed past me into the apartment, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "What did you do, Mia?" he demanded, whirling to face me. "My father called me in a rage. He said you barged into his office, threw the agreement in his face, and threatened him. He's practically having a heart attack. Do you have any idea the amount of pressure he's under right now?" "Ezekiel, please, just listen to me," I started, keeping my voice gentle. I wanted to give him one last chance to open his eyes. "Your father is lying to you, about everything." "Stop it," Ezekiel shouted, running a hand through his hair. "Just stop. I asked you for one thing, one simple compromise to keep the peace, to help my family through a difficult time, and you intentionally went out of your way to antagonize him. He's a titan of industry, Mia. He built an empire, and you're treating him like a common criminal." My heart fractured. He was so deeply entrenched in the delusion, so thoroughly brainwashed by a lifetime of Charles's manipulation. I walked over to the kitchen table and picked up one of the bank statements showing the diversion of pension funds. "He didn't build an empire, Zeke," I pleaded, holding the paper out to him. "He inherited it and he destroyed it. Look at this, just look at the numbers. He's broke. Worse than broke, he's stealing." Ezekiel didn't even look at the paper. He slapped my hand away, the paper fluttering to the floor between us. "I am not playing into your paranoid delusions because you're insecure about my family's wealth," Ezekiel spat, his words sharp and cruel. "I am defending my father. He is stressed because he is trying to save hundreds of jobs, something you couldn't possibly understand from your little cubicle." I stared at the man I loved, realizing with absolute clarity that he was gone. The kind, gentle man I had supported was completely buried under the toxic loyalty demanded by his abuser. Ezekiel pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are going to show up to that dinner tomorrow. You are going to apologize to my father in front of everyone. And if you can't do that, if you can't show my family the respect they deserve, then we are done." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I stood in the silence of my apartment, looking down at the discarded evidence of Charles's crimes on the floor. I slowly bent down and picked it up, smoothing out the wrinkles. Ezekiel had made his choice. He had chosen the illusion. He had chosen the monster. I pulled out my phone and sent one final text to David. "File the injunctions at exactly 8:30 p.m. tomorrow. Freeze everything." The stage was set. The trap was armed. All that was left was the dinner. Friday evening arrived with a chilling, crisp autumn breeze that stripped the final leaves from the oak trees lining the winding driveway of Charles's estate. I drove my modest, 5-year-old sedan up the long, perfectly manicured path, the headlights cutting through the descending twilight. The grand house loomed ahead, ablaze with lights, a monument to a legacy built on sand and sustained by theft. I parked at the far end of the sprawling lot, wedged between a gleaming silver Bentley and a sleek, black Porsche. The contrast was laughable, but tonight, I was the one holding the keys to every single luxury vehicle sitting on this gravel. I was dressed impeccably, but not flashily. I wore a tailored, floor-length gown in a deep, midnight navy, elegant, severe, and understated. I wore no jewelry save for a simple, silver watch. My armor was not made of diamonds. It was made of data, leverage, and the cold, unyielding truth resting in the leather briefcase I carried. As I entered the grand foyer, the sheer scale of Charles's delusion was on full display. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the sweeping marble staircase. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated with silver trays bearing crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted duck, and the suffocating arrogance of the 20 elite guests Charles had gathered. These were the regional directors, the local politicians, the societal power players he believed he commanded. Ezekiel found me almost immediately. He looked incredibly handsome in a tailored tuxedo, but his face was drawn, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He didn't compliment my dress, he didn't offer a reassuring smile. Instead, he gripped my elbow with a tight, anxious hand. "You came," Ezekiel whispered, his voice strained. "Listen to me, Mia. Keep your head down, don't speak unless spoken to. Father is in a volatile mood, and this dinner needs to go perfectly. When he gives his toast, just nod and smile. Do you understand?" I looked at the man I had loved so deeply, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow ache. He wasn't asking for my partnership. He was demanding my submission to protect his abuser. "I understand exactly what needs to happen tonight, Ezekiel," I replied softly, pulling my arm gently but firmly from his grasp. The heavy mahogany doors to the formal dining room swung open, and the guests were ushered inside. The table was impossibly long, covered in a pristine white linen cloth and set with heavy, antique silver and delicate bone china. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm, glittering light over the room. I was seated near the end of the table, far from the position of honor, intentionally placed between two elderly men who completely ignored my presence. Ezekiel was seated near his father at the head of the table. The first 2 courses passed in a blur of polite, hushed conversation and the clinking of expensive crystal. I ate nothing. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I checked my watch. It was 8:15 p.m., 15 minutes until David filed the injunctions. As the main course, a rich, heavy prime rib, was cleared away, Charles tapped his silver fork against his champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound instantly silenced the room. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the patriarch. Charles stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, a predatory, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Valued friends, esteemed directors," Charles began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I gathered you all here tonight to celebrate the continued strength and legacy of our great enterprise. We have weathered storms, yes, but we remain a pillar of this community, a beacon of prosperity and unwavering standards." He raised his glass slightly, basking in the murmured agreements and nodding heads of his audience. Then, his icy blue eyes slowly tracked down the length of the long table, bypassing the politicians, bypassing his son, until they locked squarely onto me. The predatory smile widened, morphing into a cruel, open sneer. "Of course, maintaining such standards requires constant vigilance," Charles continued, his tone shifting from celebratory to condescendingly sharp. "It requires protecting our legacy from those who do not understand our world. From those who look at our success not with admiration, but with unearned entitlement." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed chairs, sensing the sudden, vicious turn in the patriarch's speech. Ezekiel went pale, his eyes wide and panicked, but he remained seated, paralyzed by his lifelong conditioning. "We must always be wary of the parasites," Charles said, his voice dripping with venom, the words aimed like poisoned arrows down the length of the table. "Those who disguise themselves as partners, but who are, in reality, nothing more than common opportunists." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, pointing his chin directly at me. My blood turned to ice as my boyfriend's father sneered, "Street garbage," across the silent table. People who bring nothing to the table but their own pathetic, grasping desperation. 20 guests watched my humiliation. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of his calculated cruelty. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Ezekiel simply stared down at his empty porcelain plate, unable or unwilling to defend me. I did not flush. I did not cry. The fever that had plagued me days ago felt like a distant memory, replaced by an absolute, terrifying clarity. I reached down to the floor, picked up my leather briefcase, and set it on my lap. I unlatched it with 2 sharp, loud clicks that echoed in the dead quiet of the dining room. I rose slowly, the fabric of my gown whispering against the carpet. I didn't look at the guests. I didn't look at Ezekiel. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Charles. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of documents David had prepared: the master debt facility, the default notices, and the undeniable, irrefutable proof of the pension fund embezzlement. I walked calmly down the length of the table. The guests parted slightly as I passed, their expressions a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. When I reached the head of the table, I stood directly across from Charles. His cruel smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I slammed the stack of documents down onto the pristine white tablecloth, directly over his empty bread plate. I leaned in, my face inches from his, and kept my voice low, but sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence. "Enjoy the meal, Charles," I whispered, making sure Ezekiel could hear every single syllable. "Because it is the last one you will ever eat on my dime. I just terminated your company's only lifeline." Charles blinked, his arrogance momentarily short-circuiting. What is this nonsense?" He sputtered, reaching for the papers with a trembling hand. "That is the master debt facility from Vance Holdings," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry to the nearest guests. "The $150 million that has been keeping the lights on in this pathetic, hollow shell of a company for the last 18 months. I am Vance Holdings. And as of 8:30 p.m., which was exactly 2 minutes ago, you are in total, catastrophic default. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized." I leaned in closer, delivering the final, fatal blow. "I own your empire." Charles's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He flipped frantically through the pages, his eyes landing on my signature at the bottom of the master contract. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to issue another threat, but no sound came out. I didn't stop there. I pointed to the second stack of papers. "And those, Charles, are the wire transfer logs detailing exactly how you systematically stole $3 million from your own employees' pension, fund to pay for this house, your cars, and this very dinner." A loud, collective gasp echoed around the room. One of the regional directors, a man seated to Charles's left, snatched the top paper from the embezzlement stack. His eyes scanned the numbers rapidly, and his face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. "My God, Charles," the director breathed, throwing the paper back onto the table as if it were on fire. "It's true, you've been stealing from the workers." The room erupted. Guests began standing up, pushing their chairs back, abandoning the table in a wave of panicked indignation. But my eyes were on Ezekiel. He was staring at the documents, his entire reality crumbling around him in real time. He picked up the transfer logs, his hands shaking violently. He looked at the numbers, then looked at his father. "Dad." Ezekiel whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child. "Dad, tell me this is a lie. Tell me you didn't steal their retirements." Charles couldn't even look his son in the eye. He collapsed back into his chair, a deflated, ruined, pathetic old man, clutching his chest as the facade of his entire life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Ezekiel looked at me, tears streaming down his face, the blindfold finally, agonizingly ripped away. He had seen the monster. He dropped the papers onto his father's lap, stood up, and took a step away from the table. "I'm done," Ezekiel said, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. He looked around the chaotic room, then back to his father. "You are no father of mine. You're a thief." He didn't look back as he turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving Charles entirely alone amidst the wreckage of his own making. I watched him go, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. The surgery was complete. The cancer had been excised. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door into the cool, dark night, leaving the Thorn legacy to burn to the ground behind me. By Monday morning, Thorn Industries was a media spectacle. The injunctions filed by Vance Holdings had frozen every single corporate and personal account linked to Charles. He had attempted to flee the state on Saturday, using a chartered jet, only to discover his black cards were entirely declined. On Tuesday, the SEC, tipped off by an anonymous source containing my meticulously organized dossier, raided the towering glass and steel headquarters. Charles was escorted out of the building in handcuffs, his impeccably styled silver hair disheveled, hiding his face from the blinding flashes of the local news cameras. The embezzlement charges alone were enough to guarantee he would spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. The society friends he had cultivated so desperately abandoned him instantly, issuing public statements of shock and condemnation to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Serenity's designer lifestyle collapsed overnight. She was forced to vacate her penthouse when the holding company foreclosed on it, throwing a very public, tearful tantrum on the sidewalk that immediately went viral. 2 weeks after the dinner party, I was sitting in my small, quiet apartment, reviewing the restructuring plans for the newly acquired manufacturing assets. The buzzer sounded. I walked to the door and checked the peephole. It was Ezekiel. I opened the door slowly. He looked completely different. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. The anxious, manic energy that had always vibrated beneath his skin had vanished, replaced by a deep, weary stillness. He looked exhausted, but for the first time in the 3 years I had known him, he looked genuinely awake. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside, gesturing to the living room. He walked in, looking around the modest space not with disdain, but with a profound, painful reverence. He sat down on the edge of my sofa, staring at his hands. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mia," Ezekiel began, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve it. I was blind." I was so terrified of losing his approval that I let him convince me that the only person who actually loved me was the enemy. I let him insult you. I abandoned you when you were sick. I chose his lies over your truth. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "I am so incredibly sorry for all of it." I sat in the armchair opposite him, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a quiet, persistent peace. "You were a victim of his abuse too, Zeke," I said softly, the truth of the words hanging between us. "He conditioned you to need him, to fear him, and to defend him. But when the truth was laid out on that table, you didn't look away. You walked out. That took more strength than you know." "It doesn't excuse how I treated you," he whispered, wiping a tear from his cheek. "No, it doesn't," I agreed gently. "But it explains it. I loved you, Ezekiel. I wanted to build a life with you. But I can't build a life with someone who doesn't see my worth without a bank statement to prove it." "I see it now," he pleaded, leaning forward. "I see everything. I'm starting over, Mia. I've applied for an architecture firm downtown, an entry-level drafting position. No trust fund, no legacy, just me." A small, genuine smile touched my lips. "I think you're going to make a wonderful architect." We talked for hours that evening. It wasn't a conversation of rekindled romance, but one of deep, necessary healing. We unraveled the knots of the past 3 years, crying together over the pain and acknowledging the impossible damage that had been done. When he finally stood up to leave, the heavy, suffocating weight of the Thorne family legacy was no longer crushing him. He looked lighter. As he walked out the door, we hugged. A long, tight embrace of two people who had survived a shipwreck and were finally swimming to separate shores. The next morning, I arrived at the Vance Holdings executive office. I sat behind my desk, overlooking the city skyline. I opened the master file for the newly restructured company. My first official act as the sole owner was to fully reimburse the employee pension fund, with interest, using the liquidated assets from Charles's personal estate. The workers would retire safely. Ezekiel was finally free to build his own life. And I sat in the quiet hum of my office, a woman who had refused to be treated as street garbage, holding the undisputed keys to the kingdom.